Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 14. Dripping wet and entirely disheveled, Hannibal and Will made their way back up to Fernhill Manor. Luckily for them, the majority of partygoers were still enjoying their games on the lawn, though people were beginning to drift back toward the other, smaller activities so thoughtfully provided by the Dimmons. "Well," Hannibal said, seeing Will shiver slightly in his layers of wet clothing, the book held carefully away from him so as not to ruin it. "I don't suppose that did much for your nerves." Will laughed softly, flicking a glance up at him, and admitted, "I was too worried we would drown to worry about the crowd, Lord Clutches. It was an unorthodox therapy, but not entirely unsuccessful." Hannibal smiled at that, and took Will around the side of the manor, managing to catch a passing servant's eye. When they approached, he said, "Please inform Lady du Maurier that my spouse and I are in a predicament. We need to speak with her." The man nodded and made as if to leave, but stopped when Will abruptly thrust the book out and said, "Please return this to the library as well. I will replace it if there has been any damage." "If that's the title I am thinking of, a fire would not be damage enough," Bedelia said, drawn from the crowd by the oddity of a servant suddenly darting out of view. She looked at them both from head to toe, taking in their wet clothing and cautious expressions. "Explanations can wait, I believe." She took the book and sent the servant on his way, murmuring, "Come with me, please, both of you." Cheeks rosy with embarrassment, Will quietly followed Bedelia at Hannibal's side, hoping she wouldn't think too badly of him. He hadn't pushed Hannibal with the intention to dunk him, but he was responsible nonetheless for Hannibal's state. Just as Hannibal was responsible for his state with that entirely uncalled-for advance. "Both of you, please leave your wet things in the washroom," she said, opening a door onto a lovely tiled room, well lit by the afternoon sun. "Will, that door leads to the violet room. Your clothing is in the wardrobe. I'll see if Father's valet can assist you." "My clothing?" Will asked, bewildered as she urged him into the washroom. "Have I missed something?" "Am I to assume I have clothing here as well, or will I be wearing your purple silk?" Hannibal asked, cocking an eyebrow at his cousin as she closed Will into the washroom to clean up despite his obvious consternation. "Though I do imagine it will be a bit loose in the shoulders." Bedelia gave him a repressive look, thoroughly not amused. "You are incorrigible," she said, her tone smooth despite her annoyance. "And I have no idea what you are up to with Will Graham." She held up a staying hand when he looked as if he would interrupt her. "But if you intend to get closer to your spouse, Hannibal, you might wish to start with something less troublesome." Hannibal wrinkled his nose at her because he knew she disliked it, and pressed, "Well, has Grandfather been meddling again?" "That is something you should discuss with him," Bedelia said, a faint fleeting smile curving her mouth. "But yes, your clothes are in the wardrobe just there. Please give your husband time to tend to himself before you intrude on him." She moved back the way they'd come, and Hannibal let himself into the suite she'd indicated. Ignoring her warning, he immediately made his way to the washroom door, where he knocked once, sharply. "Yes," Will called, approaching but making no move to open up. "It's only me. I wanted to warn you I was here. These rooms share the washroom, but, alas, no locks yet again." The door cracked, and Will peeked out at him, just the barest glimpse of one large blue eye and arched eyebrow. "Have you any idea what's going on? Why is our clothing here?" "I have my suspicions. Suffice to say, I am relieved we'll not have to travel home early due to our incident." The door closed abruptly without comment from Will, and a moment later the taps turned as his spouse began cleaning himself up, bringing an unspoken but thorough stop to even the mention of what had just happened. Hannibal grinned, feeling pleased with himself, all things considered, and not entirely annoyed to think his grandfather was playing matchmaker again. Within a very short amount of time, Will was done and enclosed in his room to dress, and Hannibal made short work of washing up. Luckily, the lake water was not terribly foul, and easily overpowered by his aunt's taste for strong lye soap. He was still dressing when he heard a soft knock at the washroom door, and called entry. Will slipped in, vastly uncomfortable, but his chin at its usual stubborn angle. He was fairly well put together and dry, if not presentable. What was more immediately noticeable, however, was that sweet hot scent of him, stronger for his plunge into the lake and that same lye soap. Hannibal ducked his head to mask his notice, but it played immediate havoc with his senses, a scent he could taste on his tongue when he drew in a deep breath, as if he could trap it and hold the memory of it in his lungs. "I'm afraid I have ruined your hopes for that waistcoat. I doubt it will ever be the same again," Will said, skirting the room just a bit to linger near the hallway door. "And my old boots seem rather shabby now, but it will have to do." "The clothing can easily be replaced, and you look perfectly lovely," Hannibal told him, testing the air again. "Have no fear on that count. Your new wardrobe suits you." Will ducked his head a little at the offhand compliment, but smoothed his hand down his trim belly, unable to resist touching the fine cloth. "I am glad the second set was delivered so quickly, though I do admit I am still curious as to how it ended up here." "I suggest we ask Grandfather," Hannibal said, tugging on his jacket. He crossed to Will in a few quick, long-legged strides and took up his hand. "Hannibal, what—" Hannibal began to refasten Will's cuffs, telling him, "It is easier when one has help." Will swallowed hard, but nodded. He waited until Hannibal was finished, and then gingerly offered, "Allow me, please." Hannibal held out his hands, watching Will carefully refasten his cuffs, his movements spare and his touch gentle. His brow furrowed ever so slightly with concentration, as if some dire outcome weighed on the perfection of Hannibal's cuffs. It made Hannibal smile for some reason, seeing Will so deeply intent on something so mundane. He wondered what it would take to distract Will from his book sometime in the hopefully near future and win that bet. Just imagining what might occur and how Will would react was enough to win a soft chuckle out of him. Will's blue eyes rose at that for only a moment, long enough for him to notice Hannibal's soft expression and ask, "Am I amusing you, Hannibal?" "No," he said, turning his wrist just so to allow Will a better angle. "I was merely thinking of our situation." Will's brows rose in inquiry as he got to work on the other cuff. "I've been trying for days to think of a way to have time alone with you, Will. Had I only realized it required a boat, I would have reassessed my resources." "Ah, yes, the unfortunate boating option," Will said, chuckling softly. "Dunking one another in a lake is an unusual way to spend time together, even in my book, but I suppose it's a viable alternative when all else fails." Hannibal laughed softly with him, pleased that his mate's strange fear of him had subsided as mysteriously as it had risen. It was a pleasure to see Will without his usual guarded tension, and heartening to think that he could be coaxed out of his serious, somber rigidity. "There," Will said, finishing his adjustments and dropping his hands to his side, remembering to compose himself. The events on the lake had affected him perhaps more than he realized, and it was all too easy to imagine that Hannibal could always be the teasing, charming man he seemed. The truth, however, would not sustain even so fleeting a fantasy. As his book had warned him, it was folly to believe in promises that had no grounding in truth or reason, no matter how he might wish otherwise. "Hannibal," he said, hesitating a moment to gather his thoughts, "you really needn't trouble yourself to seek my company. I appreciate the lengths you are willing to go in order to please your grandfather, but really all we must do is wait." "Wait?" Hannibal asked, somewhat flattened to recall Will so easily telling him, "I have no interest in you." "Yes," Will said, clearing his throat. "I realize it is not spoken of in polite company, but the truth of the matter is that Miss Bloom is advancing in her pregnancy. Should she give you a boy, your grandfather will hardly complain." Hannibal blinked, watching the way Will held himself with such still, practiced composure. His defense, Hannibal knew. The studied retreat of someone who had learned to expect unpleasantness in response to his very presence. "You behave as if the outcome doesn't affect you," Hannibal murmured, seeing the minute twitch of Will's eyebrows as he fought a frown. "Is it more preferable to you, Will, that Alana gives me an heir than to provide one yourself?" Will gazed up at him, his blue eyes hard but thoughtful. "When you offered to give me a child, I humiliated you, deliberately and cruelly," Hannibal said, and Will almost flinched. "I have no right to ask your forgiveness." "You wouldn't get it," Will said, abruptly overriding him, his back stiffening. He looked away, his profile all soft curves but for the stubborn tightness of his mouth. "It's meaningless, Hannibal. We are nothing to one another but an inconvenience. I have done a great deal to keep your grandfather happy these past years, but I will not do that." He fixed Hannibal with his half-lidded, weighty blue gaze for a long moment before he added, "I have nothing to offer you, nor you to offer me." "I disagree." Hannibal, as serious now as Will was. Will's slight scowl dropped in surprise at that, taken aback as he always was when Hannibal managed to avoid his expectations. "I think you have quite a lot to offer me, Will. And I have far more to offer you than irritation and cruelty. I am determined to know you." "You're wasting your time." "Then I will waste it," Hannibal shot back, pleased by the way Will's eyes narrowed with calculation, summing his intent against known variables. "I have never minded spending time or money on something when it is worth it." Will shifted, brow furrowing, and turned away from him. Troubled and thoughtful, he turned towards the door. "I hope grandfather will not be too annoyed with us," Hannibal said, opening the door and waiting for Will to pass through before joining him in the hallway. "Though I highly doubt he could be annoyed with you, considering you are the grandson of his dear and precious friend." Will cut a look up at him, still mulling over what Hannibal had said. "If you are really so determined to find out, couldn't you ask while we're here?" he inquired, willing to let the matter drop. "Perhaps Aunt Margaret might be amenable to divulging what she knows. Uncle Robert seemed privy to a great deal." "I may just yet," Hannibal told him, striding swiftly towards the stairs at Will's side. "If you chance to speak with Uncle Robert—" They were interrupted by Bedelia, her voice raised to reach them on the landing. "Hannibal, grandfather wishes to see you." "Lecture me, more like," Hannibal said, he and Will descending the stairs in tandem. "You always have a predilection for euphemism, Bedelia." "And you a predilection for chaos," she said, reaching out to take Will's arm as he reached the foot of the stairs. "Would you walk with me, Will? Please don't keep grandfather waiting, Hannibal." Hannibal lingered a moment, hesitating, but then reluctantly left his spouse in the care of his cousin to answer his grandfather's summons. Grandfather was still in the thick of things when Hannibal finally located him, and promptly excused himself to wheel his chair toward Hannibal, frank disapproval on his face.
"Bedelia has informed me that the two of you got into a situation,"
he said without preamble, wheeling past Hannibal so that he was forced to turn and follow his grandfather back inside Fernhill, footmen anxiously jumping to clear a path and open doors for them.
"Still a tale-bearer at her age, honestly. Will was growing nervous. I thought some time on the quiet of the lake would soothe him." "You just conveniently forgot the boat, did you?"
Grandfather asked, one brow arching.
"What on earth do you think people would say had they seen the two of you,
"I didn't conveniently forget anything," Hannibal said, scowling at him.
"Nor did you, it would seem. Or was it simply by happenstance that our clothing found its way here to Fernhill?"
Roland frowned, but owned it all the same, telling him,
"If I must take extreme measures to bring the two of you together, I will do so. Leaving you stranded at Fernhill overnight is not precisely dastardly. Half of the party is spending an evening, and your aunt very graciously agreed to extend her hospitality to you. I thought it would be a very good opportunity for Will to take time away from Hertford House."
"Grandfather," Hannibal sighed, rubbing his forehead briskly.
"You needn't exert yourself. Will and I are managing." "Managing?"
Grandfather echoed and huffed softly.
"I highly doubt that. I've been watching you both very carefully today, not always personally, but by whatever method I could. From what I could tell, the only thing making Will nervous was you, Hannibal."
"Me?"
"Yes, you."
Hannibal was glad they were alone, where he wasn't forced to be so terribly formal. He crossed his arms over his chest and braced for a show of his grandfather's rare, true temper.
"You affect him with your moods because you're his alpha,"
Roland said, a disapproving frown on his mouth. He turned his chair around to face Hannibal, and stopped there, staring up at him with unwavering amber eyes. Hannibal snorted a bit at that and said,
"Not in the traditional sense, grandfather." "So, you will deny it, then?"
Roland said, his gaze fierce enough to put Hannibal on the defensive.
"Hannibal, I am going to warn you only once. That addendum will be filled. I will have that child. I will not, however, allow you to leave Will in pieces behind you yet again." Do whatever you must in the bounds of his consent to feel your end of our little bargain, but do not charm him into loving you, unless you intend to remain at Hertford House with us, and be the man I so hoped you would be."
Hannibal stayed silent. 2 very separate futures before him, all hinging on the hopes of the Omega he had used so badly 6 years before.
"Will deserves some little happiness,"
Roland said, his stare stark and grim.
"If not with you, then with someone of his choosing. Do not ruin him for someone else, Hannibal. He is so much better than what you would make of him."
"I have no intentions of charming Will into loving me, grandfather," Hannibal said, the words wooden and uncomfortable, some small window inside of him shuddering itself at the reminder of what he was asking from Will. A child, all for the sake of getting Hertford House back into his control and out of Will's. "It is a sentiment neither of us is much acquainted with. I will try my hardest to leave Will better off this time than I did before."
"So you will leave, then?"
Roland asked, a faint tremor moving through him. Pain, perhaps. Disappointment, most definitely.
"Your talk of taking him to the capital during season, your sudden fascination with him, all of those plans of yours I've been hearing of?"
Hannibal looked aside, uneasy and caught out. He summoned a smile, but it was tight and didn't fit well, tied as it was to the memory of Will's laughter and soft, gentle touch.
"I got carried away,"
he said, wishing he meant it, thoroughly chastened to be reminded of that addendum, and how easily he'd put it from his mind.
"Will would never wish to leave Hertford House in my company. Why should he? What could he possibly expect?"
Another teacup shattered? Another scar on the inside? One more scar, perhaps, than a soul could reasonably be expected to take. Grandfather said nothing. He turned his chair slightly and moved around Hannibal, who could do nothing more than watch him go, all the while a deep and searing regret moving through him. Regret which wore a somber frown and sparkling blue eyes that slowly turned away from him. Bedelia pulled Will at a sedate pace deeper into Fernhill's sprawling ground-floor level. A servant leapt to open the door for them, admitting them into the rear portion of the conservatory. The lush scent of green growth filled Will's lungs with humid air. The dappled screen of fading sunlight filtered through the verdant growth, teasing along the shimmering water of the ornamental pond within. After a long, comfortable silence, Bedelia said with weighty consideration, "You confound my cousin, Will." The soft alpha scent of her skin teased around him, a soothing balm that put him at ease and numbed some of his concern about her perception of him. "I do not do so deliberately," Will said, and added with a wry smile, "though if I knew how, I would." She chuckled softly at that, strolling slowly along the paths between the carefully tended plants. She did not press him for conversation, but Will could feel her attention focused on him, reading the subtle cues of his posture and tension in ways that only an alpha could. "It is very beautiful here," he ventured, smiling at a pair of swallows that had found their way into the vast paradise that was Fernhill's conservatory. "I thought perhaps you might like it," Bedelia said, her smile slight but genuine. "But I wanted to show you something else you might be interested in." Will nodded a little, willing to let her take the lead. They moved through the conservatory and back into the house proper to the opposite wing. Will took his opportunity to look around Fernhill as they walked. He found it quite lovely and suitably grand, if not as updated as Hertford House itself. He was so busy trying to take everything in that he almost did not notice when she pulled him into a gallery. It took him only a heartbeat, however, to realize that they were strolling amongst a collection of family portraits. She did not stop until they reached a tall portrait that seemed strangely oversized compared to the rest. Will searched it, finding a man who looked very much like Hannibal gazing out at the world with amber eyes full of mirth and a slight smirk beneath a heavy moustache. "This portrait used to hang in Hertford House," Bedelia said, dropping her arm to lay her hand on the frame. "Perhaps you recognize the place it once held?" "Yes," Will said, a strange sinking feeling in his stomach as he reckoned the cause. "It sits empty, very conspicuously so." "Hannibal is not the only lector to be possessed of a temper, Will," Bedelia said, her even tone softening her words. "I remember the day it was brought here to Fernhill. I could not understand then the explanation given to me, but as I grew up I began to." Will searched her face, seeing the slight vagueness in her blue eyes, sensing the melancholy in her voice despite her unwavering cadence. Shortly after Hannibal was born, my aunt passed away. My uncle Cyrus, Hannibal's father, delivered my cousin into my mother's keeping while he removed to the continent. She sighed, transferring her gaze to Will's own. He could feel the sorrow pooling there, and reached out without thinking to take her hand in his, relieved when she smiled. Mother said it was the grief that drove him to do it, but when grandfather called him home, he did not return alone. She cut another look up at the portrait, assessing and full of rebuke. He and grandfather fought like beasts year in and year out over the woman he brought home with him. Unsuitable, disreputable, notorious. She smiled again, wry and weary, and added, "You see, Uncle Cyrus returned with a famous opera singer, a young woman of powerful opinions and vast beauty, who was, grandfather feared, more in love with the lector titles and fortune than his son. He forbid them from marrying, so they merely lived together to spite him." Will blanched, seeing the scene play out in his imagination, a vicious row that must have frightened everyone for miles. It called to mind the argument that had followed his arrival at Hertford House, his only experience to reference that was remotely like the fight she spoke of. The Lecter men are also possessed of a rather grand impression of their own opinions, Bedelia said, chuckling softly, a purring sound filled with bitterness and sorrow. So, when Uncle Cyrus announced his attachment, grandfather announced that Hannibal was to be his heir, cutting Cyrus out entirely. Will pondered it, considering the familiar face in the portrait that seemed to hold such mischievous good humor, yet did not quite cover the turmoil within. Rather than discuss it, they clashed like rams, battering their heads against one another in a vain attempt to force sense when passion ruled, he murmured, saddened. What terrible hurt it must have caused to sway grandfather to take such actions, sending this portrait here in disgrace. It was terrible hurt and terrible anger, Bedelia agreed. It took years to mend the damage, but the breach was never fully filled. Cyrus was never reinstated to be heir, and all our hopes rested on Hannibal, who never spent a moment of his youth without feeling that weight like a stone around his neck. Will somberly met her gaze and nodded, offering, "I understand he has a heavy burden to bear, Bedelia. I have no desire to add to his troubles." "It is not the burden you might add that I wish to convey to you, Will, should you even manage to add an ounce," she said, her voice firm and even, as direct as her gaze. "Insight. He is his father's son." "Yes," she said, satisfied. "I see fire in you, Will." Heat stained his cheeks, but he did not drop his gaze. "It has been tamped down and smothered in ash, but it is there none the less," she said, pleased with him. "He will needle and prod and provoke you to find it, because he knows it is there. These Lecter men," she cast another glance up at Hannibal's father, "they are passionate men, men who are righteous in the stands they take and roused to fury when they are challenged, but one thing they cannot resist, one thing they are weak for above all other things, is something which does not yield." Will looked away, overly warm of a sudden, understanding her purpose in all of this. "You confound my cousin," she said again, and brushed his curls back behind his ear, giving one a playful slight tug to get his attention. "I would say, regardless of your intentions, you have managed to secure his interest. Whatever you do with it is entirely up to you." "And do you think I am up to the task of managing a Lecter Alpha?" Will asked, steadying his voice in a way his nerves refused to concede to. Bedelia's smile was wide and true when she said, "I have never believed anything more in my life, Will Graham." Will blushed, flustered but strangely flattered. He did not fool himself into believing he could sway Hannibal one way or another, but perhaps, just perhaps, like Scheherazade, he might be able to keep himself alive. He took another look at Cyrus Lecter, stubborn and proud, but somehow still vulnerable, his grief a wound that would not heal and drove him to desperation. "He lost so much," Will said, feeling a strange kinship with this man who would have been his father through Hannibal. "His wife, his inheritance, his father's good regard. It must have been very difficult for him." It must have been very difficult for Hannibal to lose him. No one has ever told you of that night, have they? Bedelia asked, her somber thoughtfulness returning. Grandfather has kept you insulated from what ugliness he could manage, a beautiful bird in the cage he constructed at Hertford House. Will was startled into looking at her again, questions in his eyes. There was a terrible accident, Bedelia murmured, clasping Will's hands in both of hers, her fingers strong but chilled. Grandfather and uncle argued. It was spring and storms were unrelenting. The river had risen even to the bridge, but for reasons I, to this day, do not know, Cyrus attempted to leave. The carriage overturned into the river in the darkness. Cyrus, his concubine, and their daughter, Misha, all died. Hannibal was the only one to survive. Will winced, trembling, his vivid imagination painting a terrifying portrait of what had happened to them. The roar of water was loud in his ears, so real he could feel it eddying around him, trapping him in suffocating darkness while the horses screamed in terror. He walked for miles through the woods in a raging storm to reach Fernhill, Bedelia said, so soft and faint Will could barely hear her over his gift. I will never forget that night as long as I live. Hannibal was never the same after losing them, after losing little Misha. Will blinked hard, fending off the pain that reached him when his imagination showed him Hannibal as a child, fighting his way through storm-ravaged forest for help that would always be too late. He was never the same, she breathed again, turning her glittering eyes to Will. My father will not speak to this day of what he saw when they pulled them from the river. I was not entirely sure that grandfather would survive it. Will shuddered, grimacing against the onslaught of so much pain and terror for one family to deal with all at once, for one child to deal with all at once. The traumatized are unpredictable because they know they can survive, Bedelia whispered, and Will flinched, turning away, too vulnerable in that moment with his empathy unbound, unable to defend himself against her. You are unpredictable, Will Graham, she said, and lay her hand against his cheek to calm him. You have that in common with Hannibal. Bedelia, he said, taking a breath that ached in his lungs as if water poured out with every pulse of his words. Hannibal's stepmother, was she?
Here you both are. Come along, darlings,
Aunt Margaret called down the galley at them, tapping her cane with imperious impatience. Will started, the remnants of his perception shredded by the interruption. He closed his eyes for a moment, grateful for Bedelia's cool hand against his flushed cheek.
Both of you now, Aunt Margaret urged. Cousin Atticus has arrived and wishes to meet Will. Won't do to keep him waiting, you know. He's travelled all the way from the continent.
Yes, Aunt Margaret, Bedelia said, looping her arm through Will's again with a small, conspiratory smile. We wouldn't dream of inconveniencing Cousin Atticus, would we, Will? Will swallowed his question down, but it lingered in the back of his mind, gone for the moment, but certainly not forgotten. Hannibal watched from the garden proper as the sun began to set and Fernhill servants moved about lighting paper lanterns all throughout the pathways and lakeshore. He found himself reluctant to rejoin the party with so many heavy thoughts weighing on him, and used the growing darkness to his advantage on that count. His grandfather's pointed questions regarding his intentions toward Will still occupied his thoughts and left him reflective. He'd lost sight of his goal. Rather, lost sight of the ugly method he'd agreed in order to get Hertford House back. The plans grandfather had spoken of had been made with no thought to that addendum, and had been, he knew, entirely selfish on his part. But he'd signed his name. He'd agreed, and that said more about his character than he honestly wanted to face. It was easy for him to imagine a life at Hertford House, settling into domesticity with Will, fathering his children, and keeping him company until time stole everything from both of them. He could ask grandfather to destroy the addendum, pretend it had never existed, and have that life yet. But he had no right to ask that of Will, not now. He'd forfeited that right when he'd walked away 6 years ago, and left his husband behind him without a backwards glance. There was no future to be had, only filling that addendum and finding some way to give back to Will what he'd unknowingly taken from him. It's rather unusual to find you alone at a party, Hannibal, Bedelia said, the gentle waft of her feminine scent reaching his nose before the soft purr of her voice disturbed his unhappy thoughts. She came to settle against the balustrade next to him, her blue eyes taking in the beauty of Fernhill's gardens by gentle lamplight. "Did grandfather scold you?" "No, he settled for being disappointed," Hannibal said, smiling when she smirked, "which we both know is so much worse." "Indeed," she said, taking a dainty sip of her drink. "Will Graham is an interesting Omega, Hannibal." Hannibal looked over at her, searching her profile for some clue to her thoughts. "I had not expected to find a bond," she said, tipping her head to look back at him. "I suspected something when I first met him, but not that." "Bonding? Nonsense," Hannibal said, knowing there was nothing like. "Grandfather mentioned such a thing, and I have no idea why. Entirely nonsense. Bedelia, you know how degrading I find the subject of bonding." "If you are so dismissive of it, then why did you form one with Will in the first place?" she asked, genuinely curious. Hannibal glared at her, certain he'd misheard. "You did bond with Will?" she pressed, surprise erasing her unearthly calm for only a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was measured and cautious, but full of deadly curiosity. "Hannibal, Will Graham is a bonded Omega. If it isn't with you, then with whom?" Hannibal felt a flush of terrible anger and jealousy bubble up through him with such force that Bedelia tensed in response. He looked back to where grandfather was situated and saw Will at his side once more. Bonded? It didn't make any bit of sense, not after Will's flustered response to him on the lake. He'd been flushed and alarmed, as open and innocent as any virginal maiden Hannibal had ever met in his day. Or perhaps it had simply been the embarrassed denials of a man already spoken for. A man whose relationship was forced into secrecy for the sake of appearances. Perhaps Will's assurance that he'd found the idea of sharing a bed with him boring was simply the only way he could think of to put off an alpha who would know in a heartbeat that he was already bonded and taken. Hannibal? He strained to recall the sight of Will's throat when he'd burst in on him in the bath, but he'd been too entranced by the overall picture to notice such details, and felt foolish for having been taken in so easily. Ashamed and feeling strangely hurt, he said, "You can't possibly know that." "I can, actually," Bedelia murmured, calming and taking another slow, calculated sip of her drink. "There are certain instincts triggered in unbonded alphas by an unbonded Omega his age, Hannibal. You can't have gone so long in the world without realizing." "I feel no such thing toward any Omega," Hannibal said, turning his nose up even at the idea of it. "Instincts are merely convenient excuses to indulge one's carnality." Bedelia's pale brows rose over her blue eyes as she soaked that one in. "I see." "Do you?" Hannibal demanded. "Because here you sit, trying to tell me that Will has gone and bound himself to some unknown alpha on the basis of a tingle in your pinky finger." "It's rather more complicated than all that," she said, amused by his bluster. "I do find it interesting, however, that you have not noticed or responded to the unbonded Omegas you have met since you have been married to Will Graham." "That is not interesting in the least," Hannibal said, glaring Will's direction. There was a tentative smile on his full mouth, shy and diffident as grandfather introduced him to more party guests eager to meet him. Will tipped his head up and his smile widened to a grin, slightly crooked and endearing. The thought that some unknown alpha had seen this same smile, had succeeded where Hannibal had failed, was almost too much for him. He wanted nothing more than to walk over to Will, to demand a confession out of him, and find out who had dared to— "Hannibal, stop," Bedelia said, almost a sigh, but with such pressure on her syllables that he turned his attention back to her. She blinked once, languidly, and said, "If you continue to scowl at him, everything grandfather has worked for today will be lost." He chafed to do just what he'd imagined, but his better sense won out, though he subsided with prickling irritation. "Honestly," Bedelia said, the word weary with resignation, "you are no better than a child at times." She put her cup down, daintily brushing her fingers down her dress to make it fall just so. Without even giving him the benefit of eye contact, she said, "When you are sensible and reasonable enough to realize you need help, Hannibal, please come and see me." "That will be a long wait, Bedelia," he said, catching sight of Grandfather's slight gesture that he was to join them. "Actually, I don't think it will," she said, offering him a smile that held a world's worth of secretive satisfaction. Once Bedelia swept off from his sight, Hannibal managed to calm significantly. He wondered if Will, hearing of his exploits in the capital, hearing news of his daughter's birth, had felt even a bit of the dismayed disappointment Hannibal himself felt in this moment. He honestly hoped not, because he didn't like this feeling one little bit, and wished to be free of it immediately. He had no high ground, moral or otherwise, from which to judge Will. As Will had pointed out, 6 years ago he had been willing to try to make their marriage work, despite how hateful Hannibal had been to him. Like a sacrificial lamb, he'd offered himself on the altar of Hannibal's understanding, and been soundly rejected, brutally so. Having abandoned him to silence and isolation in the country for 6 years, Hannibal could understand what would have driven Will to seek the comfort of a bond. But that didn't make him any happier about it. A short time ago it had seemed a viable option to be rid of him, but now it left Hannibal with a belly full of burning anger, and the irony of it stung. He could not, however, put it entirely past his cousin to be having him on just to rile him, and see what he would do. Hannibal refused to give her the satisfaction, were that the case, and knew that Will deserved an opportunity to speak of it in private. Determined to handle things gracefully, Hannibal returned to Will's side. He was relieved to see that his spouse was much more at ease now, though deep in thought. "Did you enjoy your tour of Fernhill?" he asked in the momentary lull they had before everyone realized he had returned. "I did, thank you," Will said, Hannibal's unusual calm soothing him. He was still somewhat adrift after the story Bedelia had told him, aching for the child Hannibal had once been. Hoping to make conversation that would ground him somewhat, he said, "It's very beautiful here, though I admit I find Hertford House more comfortable and lovely." "You have worked very hard to make Hertford House what it is," Hannibal said, trying to find a gentle way to broach the subject without stepping wrong again. "Your years of diligent service shows." Will frowned and angled a glance his way in the relative darkness. "The lights are very beautiful, aren't they? Would you care to walk around the lake again? Things seen by the light of day sometimes change in darkness, as if only then you can see what they truly are." "Why are you so suddenly agreeable?" "I am always agreeable." "Liar." Hannibal's rebuke died on his lips when he faced his spouse and found him smiling slightly, a genuine smile, half unseen in the deepening dusk. Before he could recover himself sufficiently to continue their conversation, Uncle Robert included Will in a booming recitation of his favorite poetry by taking his hand up to deliver some of the more florid lines in Will's honor. Hannibal wasn't entirely certain Uncle Robert hadn't been at the port unnoticed. Luckily for them all, the dinner gong rang out and initiated organized chaos as people began to find their dinner dates and make their way to the huge spread laid out for them. "I am sorry to interrupt you, Uncle Robert, but we're being herded to dinner," Hannibal said by way of excuse, smiling to see him take a bewildered glance at his surroundings. "Ah, I must nab your Aunt Grace before she takes some young man in my place," Uncle Robert said, and reclaimed the hand that Will had just freed to grace it with a quick kiss. "You are a delight, just a sheer delight. Remind me after dinner to show you my collection of maps, Will." Yes, Uncle Robert, he is all a twitter at the idea," Hannibal said, shaking his head a little as his uncle barreled off in search of his aunt. "Goodness, he is exhausting." "He's very clever and well-spoken," Will said, smiling after him, "and quite passionate in his speaking." "Ah, I believe the word you are looking around for is loud," Hannibal told him. "He is rather hard of hearing." He fully intended to escort Will to an empty corner and speak privately with him about his bonded status, which, as Will's mate, was his God's-given and lawful right. He could not ignore it. Neither one of them could. If Will was bonded, then that Alpha had a claim on him that superseded that of their mutual grandfather's contract, and that was a family issue. "Will," he said, steering him away toward a lively-looking space as everyone began to sort themselves to go in.
"There is something I wish to speak to you of." "Hannibal, there you are! I've been looking all over for you."
Hannibal felt Will freeze next to him, just as he did, both of them bracing for an oncoming storm.
"Thomas,"
Hannibal said, flummoxed to find his mistress's closest friend and supporter bearing down on him with a flushed grin and a glass of watered wine in one hand.
"When did you arrive?" "Hours ago. Delia just informed me you were here. I can't believe you actually came," he said, not even glancing at Will. "Alana said that you were back. She's very excited to finally see the old homestead. Simply wouldn't stop talking about the move. How soon will you be fetching them to Hartford House, eh?"
"That was a private discussion," Hannibal said, hoping to hush him, and looked anxiously at Will. He had hoped and prayed to escape the garden party unscathed, but Hannibal Lecter, war veteran, doctor, and future duke, was nearly laid waste by one look from his composed, newly reclaimed spouse. Will's blue eyes had darkened to near brown beneath his shuttered lashes, his face expressionless, retreating into reserved stillness at Hannibal's side, as if he imagined himself invisible. It was profoundly disturbing to see him so absent.
"Oh, no, old boy, don't try fooling me," Thomas said, laughing loudly enough to make Hannibal wince. "She's told me all about it. She can't wait for you to send for her and little Marissa. Galleyfield is so far away from everything, isn't it? She's bereft of good company. Why, I just saw her last week, and she was telling me about your situation."
"That was not very well done of her," Hannibal said, searching for a way to disengage from Will and drag Thomas off some place to set him straight. "As I have said, no plans have been settled."
"What's left to settle? Once that awful person is out of Hartford House, you're free to bring your family home where they belong. Isn't that right?"
He gave Hannibal an expectant look, and when Hannibal merely stared at him in awe of his idiocy, he dared to turn that look on Will and ask,
"That does sound fairly settled, does it not?"
Hannibal wanted desperately to pick Will up as he had before, just snatch him up and walk away no matter what anyone said about it. Anything really to make up for this awful, unexpected shock. "Yes, it does," Will said, his slight smile resigned, but still a million miles away, seeking safety in a place far from such unhappy and upsetting circumstances. "Allow me to assure you, sir, that I have no intentions of sharing Hartford House with Miss Bloom or any one of Hannibal's mistresses." Those blue eyes lifted to Hannibal's, hard and bright and deadly. "And considering the unique circumstances regarding Hartford House, I suppose the outcome is not quite as settled as my husband would hope. If you will excuse me, gentlemen."
"Will!"
Hannibal attempted to catch hold of him, but Will deftly eluded him, cutting through the loose crowd with grim determination.
"Damn you, sir, are you completely out of your mind?"
Thomas looked as if he'd swallowed a lemon, peel and all.
"Oh my, I'm so sorry,"
he finally managed, reaching out to lay his hand on Hannibal's arm as he strained to see over the hats, hairstyles, and heads of other guests to find which way Will had gone.
"I had no idea he was here. You should have warned me. My expression alone should have warned you," he scolded, shooing his hand off of him. "Honestly, Thomas, prattling on like that about private matters." "Hannibal, you never made a secret of your affection for Alana," Thomas protested, an irritated wrinkle appearing between his eyes. "Nor have you made a secret of your contempt of your spouse, though, now that I've seen him, I can't imagine why you'd complain." "Oh, shut up, will you?" Hannibal asked, completely out of patience. "And stop going on about my affairs. Thank you very much. If Alana has spoken of moving to Hartford House, then I know damned good and well she also spoke of it not having been settled yet. Now excuse me while I attempt to put a tourniquet to the hemorrhage you've caused." Flummoxed, Thomas said nothing to that and became quite speechless with embarrassment, which gave Hannibal the time he needed to brush past him with an annoyed huff and go in search of his little spouse. He spied Bedelia and crossed the darkening lawn to reach her, asking, "Has Will passed this way?" "I believe he is attempting to catch grandfather's coach," Bedelia told him, concern pinching her fine features. "Honestly, what have you managed to do now? He was extremely disturbed." "It was merely a misunderstanding," Hannibal said, casting around. He wrinkled his nose at her and added, "A misunderstanding that would not have occurred had you not invited a ridiculous person like Thomas Marlowe to your gathering." "Thomas Marlowe is Anthony's friend as well as yours," Bedelia said, unruffled by his sudden turning on her.
He has come every year since he was a child, Hannibal. You cannot possibly have forgotten that."
"And what of Will's sister, Lady Rathmore?" Hannibal asked, wondering where she had gone off to. Did you think it might be uncomfortable for him to see her? She upset him, you know, filling his head with ugly gossip, no doubt."
Bedelia made no move to contain her amusement at how flustered and unhappy he was. She took a languid sip of her drink and murmured, "I have never invited Lady Rathmore any place, Hannibal. Now, if you'll excuse me."
"Oh, no, you don't. You said grandfather is leaving?"
"Grandfather left," she corrected, smirking a little when he cursed. "He had hoped the two of you would pass the night here, but I believe your spouse is at this moment attempting to catch up to him. You should have more care, Hannibal, for those with whom you play. Not every doll is bereft of a heart as it pretends to be." He glowered after her, but she ignored him, making a big show of casting her attention onto her current paramour. Hannibal turned onto the path that led back toward the drive, threading his way through the partygoers heading into dinner. He reached the front of Fernhill and asked the nearest servant, "Have you seen a rather slender young man with curly brown hair?"
"He went after the Duke's coach, my lord."
"Have one of the Dimmen coaches readied," Hannibal ordered. "No, wait, bother that. Saddle a horse for me."
"My lord, I—"
"Just do it, for God's sakes, or do you not recognize the family resemblance?"
The man rushed off to carry out his orders, and in a short time a rather sleepy-looking horse was brought around, clearly not one of the Dimmen prizes by any means. Hannibal mounted and waited impatiently for his stirrups to be adjusted, nudging the horse into a canter the moment he was able, and hoping to overtake Will on the way.
"You are very quiet,"
the Duke said, a faceless and formless voice in the darkness of the coach, but his concern was touching. He had not remarked on how Will had chased the coach down, nor asked him to explain his sudden insistence to return home while the party was still in full swing. And for that, Will was profoundly grateful. "I am tired," Will softly said, glad of the darkness that could hide so much. He knew that the Duke could sense his distress, but he was, very thoughtfully, not calling attention to it. He looked out at the shadowy tree line passing beyond the windows, his thoughts tangled taut. Pride urged him to go back with his chin up, but he was unable to do so. How could he go back there, where Hannibal's close acquaintances were in attendance, waiting to unwittingly insult him? He could hardly blame them. They only knew what Hannibal had mentioned to them.
"Once that awful person is out of Artford House, you're free to bring your family home where they belong, isn't that right?"
Will shuddered, almost as angry as he was hurt, but he wasn't surprised. It was not a shock to him that Hannibal had spoken badly of him when he'd had the occasion to speak of him at all. Rather, it was mortifying to imagine that he'd been the subject of ugly conversation, not only between Hannibal and his mistress, but with his friends as well. It wasn't fair, but, as he firmly reminded himself, fair was a child's word, and he was no child.
"Will," the Duke said, somber and thoughtful, "I have watched you grow increasingly more unsettled here at Hertford House. If you truly wish to do so, then you have my permission to go to Marsham Heath after the small gathering I've arranged, but only for a fortnight."
"A fortnight will hardly be long enough to suit Hannibal or me," he said, sinking back to his seat to hide the sheen of angry tears in his eyes, Hannibal's teasing grin flashing in his mind's eye, with the whispered promise of that ridiculous bet. "A permanent move—"
"You are as much my grandchild as he is, and I want you near me, especially now,"
the Duke said, his tone firming.
"A fortnight, and no more. Jimmy must be at your side at all times. I insist on it for safety. Perhaps after such a time there will be peace enough between you to manage an heir."
"Then it is settled," Will said, closing his eyes and leaning his head back, unutterably weary and strangely hurt to think that Mina had been right after all. If Hannibal was trying to get close to him, it was only to do him harm, and Will's only sure defense was to give Hannibal what he most wanted: his absence. He would leave Hertford House the moment the Duke's party was over, and that was that.